Black Cat Lounge is sponsored by Paranormal Oddities, the little store with the big heart. Dragonfly Art and Soul. Para-Niagara, where the real ghosts of Lockport hang out. Wild Raven Candles for those magical times. Queen of Tarts, Metaphysical and Bake Shop. Hey everybody, this is Tim Shaw. Thank you guys for being here tonight. We've got a great show for you. But first, I really want to thank everybody for all the well wishes and everything you guys have sent over the last few weeks. Just to let you guys know that the biopsies that I had done and everything, which are, let's see, my 10th biopsies, and I think it's my 71st procedure. I think I've lost count. Everything is benign. Everything's great. So thanks for all the healing that guys have sent. Thank you so much for all the well wishes and and I'll be honest with you, all the crazy like memes and everything you sent me privately had me laughing so hard that my stomach hurt, which is not a good thing when you're having that type of stuff going on. So anyway, thank you guys so much, and it's going to be. I'm trying to think now. Pretty soon, I'm trying to think what the next thing we're going to be doing. I'll be with Dustin Perry up at Western Block in April. So I'd like to invite everybody to come on out there. Now, tonight's guest, I have to tell you what, I'm so thrilled. I actually got a chance to meet him in person last year at the Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan Paracon. And I found him to be probably one of the most intriguing guests that I could ever have on the show. First of all, as you guys know, I am, I cut my teeth on Hammer films. I cut my teeth watching when I was a little kid, New Year's Eve. I always remember after the Rockin' New Year's Eve thing, they used to have here in Buffalo, New York, they used to have like all the, the old monster movies and stuff. And I remember every year I would sit up there and watch it. And my mother was a big influence in my life when it came to like craziness, because her favorite movie was The Haunting, and she's the one that like got me into like all the black and whites, and I love all that. And you guys all know how how I hang out with some unique characters, within the goth culture, within the vampire cultures, how I meet these people along the way. Who knows how this works, but it works. But I have to tell you what, today's guest is somebody special. He's a sought-after speaker. Oh, my God. His schedule is insane. He's always on the go. He's always traveling. I mean, me, I go 20 miles and back. That's as far as I usually go. But this gentleman is crossing international borders constantly. It's amazing. He is an athlete. He was an Olympic coach. Guys, I mean, this guy's an accomplished guy. I'm going to say he's a Renaissance man. That's the way I'm going to describe him, as a true Renaissance man. He's the executive director of the Aiken Land Conservatory, and he's an outdoorsman, which I'm a hike. You guys all know I'm a hiker. I love being out in the outdoors. I love, being a photographer out in the wilderness. You guys all know that I used to go and do primitive treks where we only carried what we could carry in a haversack or a small container. Nothing really huge. How we got back to the land, and we would stay out there for weekends or weeks or whatever. So I have to thank this guy for really going and going out and working to preserve all the natural beauty that is in his area, and as an inspiration to other people to do that. He's a researcher. He's the author of Dracula with J.D. Barker, which is the prequel to Dracula. He is also the author of Dracula, the Undead with Jan Holt, which is afterwards, and we can talk about that. And he's the co-editor with Elizabeth Miller of the Lost Journal of Bram Stoker, the Dublin Years. That is always interesting because I like to get into the, I don't care if it's like related directly into a topic, but I like to, it gives you a little bit of a, whenever you can find something like this, it gives you a good background. It gives you the mindset. You can actually, a person actually wrote this down and you can actually dissect it, forensically dissect it in order to go and get into the head of that person. And I love that. And if I got a chance to see something like that, it would be amazing. It would be amazing. He's also the great grandnephew of the creator of Dracula, Bram Stoker. Please welcome Dacre Stoker to the Black Cat Lounge, and it is an honor. Thank you so much for taking the time to come here today.
Absolutely, Tim. My pleasure. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I'm going to ask you a lot of probably basic questions that you get asked all the time, and the number one question that I always wonder about when as someone who is proud of their lineage. I mean, I've got Civil War relatives, and my family goes back to the early 1800s here in the U.S. What was it like when you first found out that you were directly, I won't say directly, but I mean you were related into Bram Stoker, someone who was really, when you think about it, he was one of the big Gothic writers of the Victorian time period.
Yeah, so let's put that in perspective because you hit it right. It's interesting. Of the family that Bram was born into, there were 7 kids, and only 3 of them had any offspring, which was not typical back in those days. They usually had a lot of offspring, and sadly, a lot of them would die. But only 3 had offspring, and only 2 have offspring with lineage still to this day alive. So my connection to Bram was that Bram's youngest brother, George, Dr. George Stoker, was my great grandfather. So of his children, he had a son, a daughter. The daughter never married. The son did. He came to Canada, Montreal. After World War I, he got married, and that became my grandfather. Bram had a son. That son married, had a daughter. When she married, she actually married 2 different people during World War II. Both unfortunately died. They were airmen, if you can believe it, over the war. And that's when the Stoker name in that particular line went away. So of the Stokers, there's just my line, and we have some of Bram's family, the McCalls, the Dobbs, still alive. So yeah, we kind of chat about these things. If you had any interesting things happen to you, or people talk to you or raise an eyebrow and wonder what it's like. So here's my somewhat serious story, but it's not all that glamorous, Tim. And that is, growing up in Montreal, like most North Americans, we do a big thing with Halloween. And as Halloween would roll around, I was a schoolboy, at the age of 12, 13, people joke that they would prepare to come to our house. Oh, we're going to come to your house at Halloween. We're going to either paper you, or what are we going to do at the Stoker house? Are you going to take our blood, or are you going to give us candy? Ha, ha, ha. And it took me a while to sort of trigger, like, what, Dad, what are they talking about? What is this big thing about the blood? And so my father said, son, it's now time to tell you. You're old enough to learn this. And he brought me downstairs to our family library, and he pulled out, first edition of Dracula. And inside, he opened it up, and it was inscribed from Bram to his mother.
Wow.
And it was May 24th, 1897, which was actually 2 days before the regular books came out. So this was an early edition, a galley proof, or whatever they had back in those days.
Right.
So that changed, at least my perspective a little bit on Halloween. We're connected to the guy that everyone's dressing up as, or the movies. The Munsters were out in those days. The Addams Family. Dark Shadows. You mentioned cutting your teeth on Hammer. That's where I sort of were introduced to the legacy of my great granduncle, and I really didn't know much about him beyond that. Nor did my dad. So it wasn't until a few years later that I was in university and started getting interested, and managed to pick up a book that maybe some of the listeners of the Black Cat Lounge have also read. But it was McNally and Florescu from Boston College wrote a book called In Search of Dracula.
Yes.
And it's their research that helped me learn about Bram Stoker's research for Dracula. They're the guys that went to the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia and discovered, as they were looking for a woodcut about Vlad, they discovered the Dracula notes, and everything just kind of rambled on from there.
I'm one of those people that saved up. I'm gonna admit my age here. I'm one of those people that saved his allowance and went to a little bookstore and bought In Search of Dracula.
Oh, cool.
I was,
Oh, good for you.
I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I still have that copy in my little library, because that was one of those things that just I was able to. I've always been a history guy, and that was one of those things that I was able to touch. This unbelievable huge legend, but yet I could touch it, just by reading his words and where they went, and being able to go and just let my brain just allow myself to go and just be overcome by, the way they wrote it and the way they described it and some of the photos in there. That was probably one of the best books I've ever, that, and of course Burroughs' Conan the Barbarian. You gotta throw that one in there too. But for Goth, the early, something that kind of went and had a tie-in with Goth, that was a seminal book on vampirism that I actually knew, or actually bought and read. Now I have to ask you this. What's amazing to me is something that I did not know. I did not know this. Now I did understand that Bram had known Conan, Arthur Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, and I knew, and as a spiritualist myself, and my family has had spiritualism in my family for generations. So I did know about him and his whole spiritualist movement. What I did not know this, and I am ashamed to say this as an American and as someone who reads, I did not know that Mark Twain was Bram's neighbor.
Yeah. Isn't that amazing?
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
But it goes beyond the fact that they were just neighbors. They were tight. Bram actually helped him function as an agent for Mark Twain in England to have a book published round about the equator. And funnily enough, that's where Bram, I'm sure the two of them sat down and chatted about things like spiritualism and faith and other things. Mm-hmm. But that the famous line is faith is believing in things you ain't so. Bram actually took that line from Twain and inserted it into Dracula at a key place, and where Van Helsing is trying to have a serious discussion, which he does over a number of chapters with Dr. Seward, to get scientists in the group to believe, let down his guard a bit on strict scientific procedure, and let down his guard and understand, or at least accept the possibility that the supernatural exists, that the vampire is possible, and that's why the blood that they're transfusing into Lucy keeps disappearing. And the next morning they come back after giving all this blood, and she's void of blood, but there's no big pool of blood on the floor. So he comes to Seward and says, I need you to believe. What do you mean? Believe in what? Believing in things you know to be untrue, which is just taking Mark Twain's words a little bit and moving them around, because that's what faith is all about. We can't prove it scientifically, but you need to believe that it's possible that it really does exist, the presence of the supernatural.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm one of those people. I'm a graveyard walker, man. And Mark Twain, actually, Samuel Clemens actually lived here in Buffalo, in my hometown, for a number of years, and he was a editor of the newspaper and all that. But he's buried about an hour and a half's drive away from here in Elmira, New York. So I've always gone, so every time I go through Elmira, I always stop. I always stop to visit the grave, and it's sort of like thank him for being one of America's like earliest authors, where of some common note. And next time I go down there, I'm going to say thank you for adding to the great classic Dracula by just being you. That's phenomenal. I did not know that.
there's a bunch of other stories. I'll tell you one of them, but there's lots of other things we could talk about the connection between these two fine individuals. But one of them is cool family lore, and that is that Florence Stoker, who was home a lot, when Bram was out doing his thing at the Lyceum Theater, they invited Mark Twain to come to tea, and so Florence gave Bram strict orders, get back home in time, because he used to come home a little bit earlier, have tea, have a bite to eat, and then go back for the performances in the evening. So he said, make sure you come back tonight, Bram, in good time, 4 o'clock, for having high tea with Mr. Mark Twain. So she went downstairs to the housekeeper and said to her, now, don't let anybody come to the house. We don't want to be interrupted when Mr. Twain comes for tea. We need some privacy. Fine. Bram Stoker rushes home, runs upstairs, gets changed into some nicer clothes. And Bram and Florence are sitting up there, and they're looking at the clock, and 4 o'clock goes by, 4:10, 4:15, 4:20, 4:30, nothing. And so Bram rings the bell, summons the housekeeper to come upstairs and says, what's the matter? Has anyone come to the door? She says, yes, Mr. Clemens came to the door, but I told him to shoo off. We were expecting somebody very important.
Oh my God. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Those are the stories that flesh out the humanity of these idols, of these celebrities of the past. Because can you imagine Twain standing there and just laughing about it? Because
exactly.
he had to do it, because he would see the humor in that. That is the
try to maybe just talk his way by the Irish maid, or just, no, this is too good. I'm gonna use this against Bram at some point and just go home.
Exactly. Now the time period is the Victorian time period is one that, and you briefly talked about it with the excerpt from Twain in Dracula. But the Victorian time period is one of those time periods where it is amazing, because it's, especially in England, in the UK, because you have this unbelievable surge of science and all this stuff that's going on, and real communication, going through the telegraph, and all these developments in medical developments and electricity, and you have all this stuff going on. And yet you have, on the opposite scale, you have all this really terrible poverty. You have all this stuff going on. So you're kind of like, it's kind of like in a balance. And what I found, what was unique, was that it said that if you can't explain it by science, it has to be belief. And when you brought that up, this, during the first little story, you have to think about that. And even today, when we start looking at, and again, I do a little, I do some paranormal stuff. Some, yeah, right. I've noticed that it's science just trying to catch up a little bit. And I know in spiritualist circles, when I went through Lyceum, which is the spiritualist Sunday school, they always told me as a kid, it's always there. But science is just slow in,
catching
up. Yeah. And to me, that was amazing.
You mentioned that it needs to be mentioned that this sort of period of time, Bram wrote the book between 1890 and 1897. So sort of the last 10 years of the 1800s, there was the greatest number of science and technological changes ever in the history of man. And as you touched on this had a profound effect on people questioning religion, because science was there in the picture. Charles Darwin had just published Origin of Species a few years before. It rocked the religious and scientific world on the back. And gas lighting was being phased out for electricity. That was scaring people. So there was a lot of things going on. Some people have kind of referred to it, as a second enlightenment. And this didn't sit well with establishment. And yet forward-thinking people, like if you and I were living there, we would have created our own little secret society, or we'd be in the Freemasons or the Golden Dawn, where we would be discovering and would be free behind closed doors to discuss these things and to look into these things. We would have probably gone to seances. We would have had tarot card readings. All these things were percolating, and and had a lot of respect. Like nowadays, paranormal investigation, people respect it. It's not, hoochie stuff. So even though none of it could be explained by science, that science at the time, it's still accepted because people are open-minded enough. And those people who were open-minded, like Stoker, like Mark Twain, Conan Doyle, and others, were like looked at sometimes being a little strange and edgy, but amongst their peers, they were like, these guys are really with it. And that's one of the reasons why Dracula was so popular, is all this, references to supernatural, to occultism, to spiritualism, found a place in this novel.
Yes. Yes. Also, what's kind of amazing is we start looking at the mores of the Victorian age and how outwardly they were so repressive. Yet there was such a outwardly, because when you start looking into this, and this is something that, again, delving into the political mores and the social mores of New York City and that sort of stuff during the 1860s going to 1880s, you start seeing that whole nasty underbelly, that erotic, that where it was like everything was hidden, everything was hushed, yet it was an open secret. And do you think that a lot of that, and I know what the answer is, of course, but do you feel that a lot of that was incorporated in Dracula for to bring it to the forefront, or maybe a little shock value?
Yes. I mean, Bram made some statements, and I think they were probably organically. It wasn't, overtly, I'm taking a stand on this. But, things like introducing science and technology to his world in order to advance the world. Let's not be stuck back in the years when people, really believed in creatures of the dead coming out of the grave and sucking the life out of others. We've got to incorporate some of this new tech. And he also introduced mesmerism into the story. And telegrams and telegraph and searchlights, all these new tech stuff was sort of Bram's way of saying, all right, if we embrace these things and use them properly, but for good,
right?
This whole idea of good versus evil, all for good, as well as scientific experimentation. This was another kind of sideline that I've just started talking about more because I've done more research. Bram's brother, the Dr. Sir William Thornley Stoker, who helped him with all the medical information in Dracula to be absolutely correct. He was also the head of something called Inspections on Vivisection, which is the animal experimentation for educational purposes. But it got out of hand in the Victorian era because so many people were, cutting the skulls open of monkeys and dogs and essentially torturing them to get a lot of excitement by the medical students. So when you look deeply into Dracula, and a lot of people do that, Tim, guys like you and I do it because we want to know all the little details. You will see that Bram was referring to Count Dracula as one of these evil scientists that were coming to England to do experiments on Renfield with the bugs. That was it. That was described in the story as an evil experiment. Bringing the boxes of dirt, the 50 boxes of dirt, was another experiment. And so they were referencing subtly, Bram was, top shelf issues of the day in medical science, also in technology, and it's all kind of bundled into this book with this mustard yellow cover, kind of as a horror novel, but really it's an up-to-date science fiction novel.
It's amazing how he went and was able to marry all of these characters together. Because let's face it, if you start looking at it, and if you start dissecting all the characters, they are from different places. They're from different social statuses. Yet he was able to bring them all together. And I think what's really amazing, and again, the movies don't do the book as all movies don't do any of the books justice. You start seeing, that poor Renfield. You start seeing, how they portray him in the movies as as this crazed, maniacal, idiot, basically. But
Yeah.
yet you're right. I never thought about it in that way, where they start talking about bugs and they start talking about how all these surgeries were actually done. And did they? I can't remember if they trepaned him.
They did.
Yeah,
Let me tell you about this one, because in
yeah,
Bram's notes in the Rosenbach Museum is actually a couple of pages that his
yes,
brother Thornley Stoker literally wrote and then drew actually how to do brain trephination surgery. And
wow,
this is for
wow,
the listeners here. Renfield gets beat up by Count Dracula. Dracula comes into his cell in Seward's asylum, and because Renfield is basically spilling the beans to the band of heroes too much about what's going on with his master.
right,
So he's giving away information. Dracula comes in, beats him up, slaps him around, and he ends up having brain bleed, brain swelling. They think he's got a broken neck. They diagnose it as brain bleed. Thornley Stoker himself, I found this in medical journals, performed brain trephination up until this point 3 times. One time the patient died of infection, 2 times it was successful. And it was described in the notes to Dracula, and then Bram took that and described it in the novel exactly the same way as Thornley did it to one of his patients who was
wow,
conscious during
wow,
the operation, and spoke to the doctors just like Renfield did, and they got him a glass of brandy or something, but in the real life it was water. So this was real life, high end, cutting medical surgery at the time. Bram himself had a soft spot, as did his mother, for the plight of people with mental health problems. Thornley Stoker not only was a physical doctor, but he also worked at the at Swift's hospital. That's as Jonathan Swift,
mm-hmm.
um, who left all of his money. He left to this hospital, an endowment for people with mental problems. So Thornley worked at Swiss Hospital as well as Richmond Hospital. So he did double duty for people with medical and physical problems. So they were very aware of what was going on. And we know it's sad. There was an act in the government in England to create asylums. Up
Yes,
until this point, Bram was
yes,
very concerned about this. He actually is on record of going into prisons and interviewing mental patients so he could characterize his Renfield character just right. So when this act came around and guys were put into asylums, they weren't much better than prisons because nobody knew what the heck to do with these poor guys.
right, right.
Advancement in medicine for mental patients was not very well. But this is one of those subtle statements you asked me about 15 minutes ago, and I start rambling. I'm sorry.
It's all right. I love this.
Yeah.
But now, okay, now the other thing that I want to bring up was Bram was a sickly child that turned, basically he turned his life around eventually, and he actually was very, very robust and healthy. How much of that do you think was played an influence on his novel Dracula? Because I often think about children who are sickly, and it often really imprints upon them some type of they either become very, bullyish to people once they get to that point, or they get very compassionate. How do you think that affected him and the characters that he created for Dracula?
So, first 7 years of his life, there was some mysterious illness that kept Bram bedridden. We don't know exactly what that was. I've got my theories that I will share with you. And my theory is based on the fact that he made this miraculous recovery at the age of 7.5 or something. And within 10 years, he was a champion athlete at Trinity College in a very wide variety of sports. It involved race walking, rowing, track and field, weights, so rugby. So it wasn't just, some type of sport. It was everything, showing that he was turned into a very robust, strong, tall, 6'2" young man. So when I looked at that recovery and took it to people who are, sort of forensic doctors that look at
Hmm.
Victorian illnesses and things, we sort of analyze this forensically. And I would say it's a conclusion with a lot of circumstantial evidence. We think he had some kind of very serious respiratory allergies and asthma. When we analyzed what he was living in, the bedding, the moist
Oh my God, yes.
atmosphere
Yeah.
in Clontarf, which was on Dublin Harbour, and the bedding was straw covered in linen, that all of that mold and mildew would have kept him sick, not just made him sick for a while. He can't get away from it. And we also know that one of his brothers had asthma and allergies. And we know that brothers in the family and great grandsons, my sons, some of my nephews, all have asthma. So we know it
So,
ran through the family.
hmm.
And we also know that when the family moved about 2.5 miles inland to a drier environment, Bram got better. And these are things you recover from. Other diseases that were popular at the time, rheumatic fever, scarlet fever, you either die from or you're somewhat crippled.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that's what I think he had. And to get back to your question, do you think it affected him? Darn right it did, because he left not very many things that he wrote about himself. No autobiography. In his journal that I found, it had nothing about his own health, but he did write a book about his famous employer, Henry Irving, who he worked for 27 years, many years later. And then he reflected on his own childhood. He said, in my childhood, I was often near the point of death. I never knew what it was like to stand upright for the first 7 years of my life. And my long illness gave me opportunities to reflect upon things and essentially gave me a very good sense of imagination. So, Tim, I think those times in bed, either being told stories by his mother or his nanny, obviously, I'm not sure what age he started to read at, but that would have happened at that stage. Lots of times to think and also, sadly, be horrified by the stories of Irish folklore, which are not all leprechauns and pots of gold at the end of rainbows. These are
Yes.
cautionary tales of their own versions of vampires and creatures, banshees, pukas, changelings, things that do take the
Right.
life out of others. So I think he came upon this stuff in a traumatic way, and I think he's darn lucky that as Sigmund Freud would say, you are what happens to you as a child. That he didn't turn out to be a really screwed up individual. That he was able to channel this stuff in his sense of imagination, and he did live within himself, and he did
Hmm.
become, luckily an athlete, which meant involvement with other people, but he also learned to love drawing. He learned to love the theater, these things that are sort of make believe, and he became a theater manager. And his writing then was his private thing. But he was still a very gregarious guy running a big theater with lots of employees and actors and actresses, and they traveled around the world with him leading the way. So he got lucky, but in a funny way, I think his dark side of imagination is what we benefit from today by the writing of Dracula and the Lair of the White Worm
Hmm.
and some of his other dark stories.
Now, when we start looking at that time period and the age, I think really he was one of those people that he was he was a creation that came at the right time and had the mythology and had all of this historic stuff that was going on to influence him into writing something was dark. I mean, let's face it, people don't realize that this was written during the time of the Ripper murders
Yeah.
and all of this, and people don't see that. And by the way, we have a light suspect, Doctor Tumblety.
Yeah.
He's actually buried in Rochester, New York, which is about 2 hours from my house, and I'm researching him right now, and I'm going to take a ride and I'm going to visit him and photograph his grave shortly in April when I
Well,
when I'm out and
listen, we
about.
got to pause there for a sec because your listeners need to know that Francis Tumblety was a very close friend of Hall Caine. Hall Caine was a very famous author at the time.
Yeah.
more famous than Bram was a very close friend of Bram's, and he is the guy that Bram dedicated Dracula to.
Oh, I did not know that.
The nickname, you guys can check out Dracula online for free on Project Gutenberg, or you can go to, not my site, but a good friend has put up bramstoker.org that has all of the books that Bram wrote, public domain, for free. And you'll see that the name of the guy who Dracula was dedicated to was Hami Beg, which is from the Isle of Man, the Manx men. That's the nickname, Tommy Kane, Paul Kane. And so these guys are all intertwined, just as you said, Tim.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah, it is.
That's just amazing. And, and I mean, and it's so funny because of the fact that we're looking at that time period, and you have this cast of characters. You have villains, and you have all these saints, and you have all these people that interact, and they all come together in Dracula, which is like blows my mind, because this is what kind of an author he was, to be able to go and pull all these characters properly together in order to go and create a believable story and a horrific story, and still have it as, I guess the best way I can describe it is he allowed it to become a morality play, if you look at it in that way.
Yeah, he was there. There's definitely that. And I like the fact you said believable. That to me was one of the things that I really get fixated on when I do my Stoker on Stoker presentations around the world. I said, listen, here are the things that Bram interjected to make the readers of the day convinced it was real. Number one, Jonathan Harker is about 80% Bram Stoker. Bram worked as a legal clerk in Dublin. He became an inspector of legal clerks. He wrote a legal manual. He came to London. He was offered to become a lawyer. He turned it down to stick with the theater. He wrote his own contracts. There's so many things about Jonathan Harker, this young lawyer that goes to Transylvania for the land transaction deals to consummate them with the count. That's Bram.
Yes.
But all these other characters that you talked about, they all represent different parts of society, and everybody has a stake in the game. Even Mina, being the modern woman, is Bram's mom, and his sister, modern women. But then you've got Holmwood, the Lord, who is up here and represents certain things, and of course Quincy Morris is basically Bram's good friend, Buffalo Bill Cody.
Yes,
I mean he's merged all these things together to make it believable. And in his notes, he wrote a day timer with all the dates and all the activities in the novel to line up so they happened in 1893. Even though the book came out in 97, he wanted it to fall within 1893, so it was all accurate. All the distances were calculated. The maps were all accurate. He even left coordinates to the end of the novel, to where the final battle would happen on the base of Mount Israel, the volcanic mountain in northeastern Transylvania.
I actually have. I believe I have a picture of that. That's it right here.
Yeah, those. You see that little bump right in the middle of the screen, way up top there. Yeah.
I made sure you know what, as I was researching, and then I went back to read a little bit, I said, you know what, I have to find this place. It's something that I did not know. So, I mean, I went and I found this, and I'm going, this is amazing. But you know what was really amazing is now I know my brain is a little foggy, so you have to forgive me. The lost, the typeset that was not
script, the
type script that was not put in the book, and how it revolved around Castle Dracula, and where these coordinates were. Now it ended up being in it was in a desert, right, where they brought it, where they would have taken you, but in reverse it took you there.
Yeah, okay. So it's not your brain. Listen, this is like a massive puzzle. I'll try to boil it down
This
for you
this
guys.
is to me, you know what, Dacre, this is like, to me, is amazing, because these are the little nuances that like really fascinated me. And I'm just, the more I started delving into this interview, the more I'm going, wow, I can't believe I missed this, or I can't believe I didn't know that, or oh my God, this is like this is like gold to me.
Listen, it's like gold to me because I guess I don't know if I inherited the Irish storytelling. Um, I've been able to put together good stories, and I find good co-authors to help me write them, and I've been lucky. But the story of this, I can't. I'm hoping everything works, but I'm working on a film documentary with an Irish guy, Jason Figgis,
Oh, that's awesome.
in Dublin, to have this documentary come out this coming Halloween. And it's all about exactly what it said, putting the puzzle together. And here's what the pieces are to explain this piece. It's about 4 pieces to give one part of the story great light. That is the end of the novel and the location of Bram's fictional castle Dracula. So we all know that there's a castle in Transylvania called Bran Castle.
Right,
Bran.
right,
And,
correct.
and their marketing has they've decided to call it for many years Castle Dracula. And it ticks off a lot of purists because Vlad Dracula,
Mm-hmm.
Prince Dracula from Wallachia, had nothing to do with Bran Castle. And Bran Castle in the town of Bran, just outside of Brasov, is 400 miles south of where the Borgo Pass really is, and Bistrica, all the other places that Bram laid out in the story. So it's like this conundrum. Why did Bram Stoker refer to this castle that he described it exactly as Bran Castle looks like? So once the books were discovered in the London Library about 3 years ago, I was sent over or asked to come over to help verify that these are really the books, because Bram wrote lots of funny things in the margins, and I know what his writing looks like. We can verify he actually did these scribbles in the margins. But it helped us realize that there are only 2 sketches of castles in any of these books. And it's a one castle. 2 sketches, 2 different books. Charles Bonner, Elizabeth Mattucelli, both sketched, because it's so picturesque, sitting on top of a massive high rock, Castle Toursberg, which when it's translated into English to this day is Bran Castle. So we know that's the appearance of the castle that Bram was looking at in one of his books. He never went to Transylvania. He had to rely upon this. But in the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia, he left these coordinates in one of the pages. And my buddy Hans de Roos from Germany, we've been to Transylvania, we've been sniffing around and thinking about writing a travel book and all this stuff. He Skyped me, this is how old this was, and said, Dacre, I think I've found this, but it's ridiculous. When I look at these map coordinates, it ends up, the nexus point, in the Saudi Arabian desert. And I said, yeah, but Hans, Bram was really into ciphers, because he actually had in his own library the Francis Bacon cipher, bilateral cipher book. He was really, and one of the books that he wrote since Dracula, called The Mystery of the Sea, involves all these ciphers. So I said, why don't you invert those numbers? And there he did. While we're on Skype, he did. And he was like jumping out of his skin. Oh, yes, on this mountaintop right next to Borgo Pass. Because, guys, Borgo Pass is not a made-up name. It is a mountain pass in northeastern Pennsylvania, right next to the Moldavian border. Funnily enough, about a half an hour hike to the top of Mount Israel, which is an extinct volcano where these lines of longitude and latitude line up just as Bram left in the notes. So that is 9/10 of the puzzle, but I'll finish, because what Tim was talking about, I verified all of this with the Dracula typescript, not the notes, but Paul Allen, the guy that was a co-founder of Microsoft and many other things, bought the Dracula typescript at auction about 10, 15 years ago. And when J.D. Barker and I were doing our research for Dracula, we got an invitation, or talked our way into this, to go out to Seattle to analyze the typescript, because we knew from one other researcher that had access to this. And it started on page 102. There was lots of things cut out. And we could maybe talk about some of those with time left, but I will tell you this, the original ending of Dracula, there it was, crossed out. And the original ending, right after the Count was stabbed by a Bowie knife, not a stake, and his throat was slit, not decapitated, no garlic put in, just like the Band of Heroes did to Lucy. The Count crumbled into dust, made his escape, and then a massive volcano erupted. Now, what's significant about that? The mountain that Bram described and the mountain that Bram had the coordinates for was an extinct volcano. And Bram was so detail-oriented that if he was going to have a volcanic eruption, and incidentally, volcanoes in those days, Tim and I were talking about all the things that were strange in the Victorian era. They believed these were portals to hell, the home of the devil.
Yes.
So Count Dracula, in Bram's thinking, would have made his big escape, either back into the volcano or the volcano was erupting to get rid of everybody. We're not sure, but that was deleted. And my thought is it was Bram or his editor saying, Stoker, you got a good one here. Let's not kill off this guy at the end. Let's not have a wooden stake. Let's have him escape, and then volcano erupts and to scare off all his hunters, and Dracula lives another day. So those are quickly, Tim, sorry, but those are the pieces that all different museums, different continents, different countries all come together when somebody like me takes the time with the help of guys like Hans de Roos, the Rosenbach Museum, and Paul Allen. All these guys put the stuff together. We get the logical picture of what happened.
Right. Now, we're already running out of time. I cannot believe how quick this interview is going because I'm just so fascinated. Let's talk about your work. You have written. Let's talk about first the prequel, Dracula. What spurred you on to kind of add to Bram's work?
Well, it started a little bit backwards. But we'll start with the prequel. I did a Star Wars thing. I wrote the sequel first, but what really bothered me was what you and I talked about maybe 20, 30 minutes ago. How does Bram actually recover from this mysterious illness? And if I fictionalize that, is it possible, because the novel Dracula is so darn real, is it possible that Bram's recovery had something to do with supernatural? And if so, does he have some knowledge about the presence of vampires? And if that's the case, because there was a lot of vampire lore, not only in Ireland, but he found some in a newspaper in New York about the New England vampire scare in 1896, Mercy. While he was still Mercy Brown, Sarah Tillinghast, all these others. So I'm thinking my famous relative could have written Dracula as a warning to the world that vampires were real. And if so, let's go into that story. What would have his experience been? What could it be? And so JD and I wrote Dracula, the prequel, in the epistolary style, leading up to Bram starting from his mysterious childhood illness to the time when Bram decides to write Dracula and get on with warning the world. Wow. It became a bestseller. It was the #1 horror hardcover in UK. And it's been optioned by Paramount. So look, it's a great success.
That's fantastic. Now, again, the first work goes like 25 years into the future and kind of follows the Harker family, where he's out there and he discovers this curse that all this nastiness and all this evil that his ancestors had actually gone and
experienced. Yeah.
I've read it. And I'm afraid to go. I don't want anybody to go and spoil the ending for people, because it is a phenomenal book. But did you feel that you had to put like a finish to it? Did you have to finish? To me, it's sort of like when I read it, I'm like, oh, this kind of ties it even in more. And now it's another generation. And I'm going, oh, this could just keep on going on and on and on. That was so exciting about it.
Yeah, I mean, you've already heard me describe how Bram left an ambiguous ending at the end of Dracula. He kept his count
Right.
alive, right? We did the same thing Ian and I did with Dracula the Undead. We had to bring it back because we felt Dracula wasn't dead, but it wasn't going to be quite that simple. And then it ended in a way, another sort of major cliffhanger to say it's possible that this is going to keep going, and it still is, but we just have to. I can't tell all my secrets yet and what we're waiting for and so on.
Don't spill the beans. Don't spill the beans.
Just go read the book. Just read the book.
Just read the book. What's wrong with you people? Read the book. You know.
Yeah.
And I have to tell you something. It was great. This last year I had a cornea transplant and it was tough for me to read. And anybody that's gone through that and has started losing their eyesight in one of your eyes, you know how imbalanced it is. I'm going to tell you what. 2 weeks after, this is the honest to God truth. 2 weeks after I had it, my eyesight was really improving, and new glasses, and really, it's kind of amazing. But I picked up that book, and I was just paging through it so I could go, and I just enjoyed it. And I reread the ending again, the last two chapters.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so I was like, I'm going to admit that to you because I've been a fan, and it's like, wow. And again, I don't want to go and spoil it for people, but it is a wonderful book. Tell everybody all about, because we're starting around a time now, which I'm really sorry about, because I really think this is one of the most fascinating interviews I've done in a long time. Tell everybody how they can find out more about Dacre Stoker and what you're doing, where how they can get your books, where they can buy them, where you're speaking. That is, and the one thing I will tell you is when this past year, when we were at the Michigan Paracon together, I actually left my table and came and listened to you.
Oh, nice.
I actually left it. I put a little sign going, "Be back after the vampire's done," and I left.
Well, I know it's tough for my fellows who, that's how we make money. They sit at our table and sell books and sign autographs. But here's the nutshell. So I'm also one of the things I felt obligated to do is I've been working with a fellow whose name is Robert 18 Basang, who is a contemporary of Elizabeth Miller, the two foremost vampire Dracula experts in the world. And they both brought us the transcription of Bram's notes from the Rosenbach Museum. Wow. And Robert contacted me and said, I've done that book, Bring the World Bram's Notes. That can be purchased. Notes for Dracula. I want to do the same for Dracula with the Paul Allen typescript. So we both independently contacted Paul Allen estate. Paul Allen has passed away. They did not want to publish the typescript. And what's too bad about that, Tim, is that you see all the things crossed out, all the things added in different handwriting. And Robert and I were kind of ticked off about that. Because technically they do own the paper that he bought for $1 million, but Bram Stoker estate, my cousins, they own the intellectual property of that, and yet they can't do anything without the blessing of the Allen estate.
Right.
But because the two of us actually took lots of notes and had a lot of good memory as to what was taken out, we reconstructed Dracula.
Oh, awesome.
So we have reconstructed in a way, it's available on Amazon. Dracula annotated for the 125th anniversary.
Yes.
We put back in what we believe to be the 3 chapters based on the typescript and the notes, put back into Dracula, and all the things that were probably 90% taken out of the typescript, taken out. And that's available on Amazon. But the cool news is also coming out this Halloween is an NFT version of Dracula reconstructed. But instead of the annotations, I've already done all these 110 videos that are attached into the electronic version of this book, along with 31 pages of the notes from the Rosenbach Museum that back up all of my arguments about what connects this, like we talked about the page of the Dracula notes, how all that works. So this will be, one of these things. More information on dacrestoker.com or on my Facebook page, Dacre Stoker author. And you can contact me there. That's where I'll publicize all this stuff. The other place where I publicize things and drop lots of cool information about Bram is bramstokerestate.org. and my books are for sale there. You can order them from there, and I sign them and send them out. But you can also get, I think all of them are available. Even the graphic novels that I've got into, Tim,
That's
are
awesome.
available on Amazon.
That's awesome. Dacre, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to be my guest. This is great. And you know what? We sat next to each other at lunch that day. And first of all, I'm sitting there and everybody's talking, and it was like overwhelming. And I wanted to sit down and I wanted to talk to you, but these things, you don't talk to anybody during these events.
I know you're wolfing down food to get back to your table.
That's exactly it. And it's just an honor for you to take the time to be on my show. And it really meant a lot to me that you did. Just hold on a couple minutes. I want to thank you properly off the air. And again, seriously, this is almost, and I'm going to tell you what, this is like the culmination of all these years of me like loving everything to do with a little bit of the Gothic culture, all of the, all of the fun stuff out there, the Hammer films, all the books I've read. This is probably the culmination of all of that, all these years. I'm 66 years old and I'm like a little school kid. I'm so excited having been able to talk to you. So this was really great.
I appreciate, I go on a lot of these things and not everybody is as well prepared or as enthusiastic. I also want to say good job on bouncing back from all your procedures. So hang in there, stay healthy, and keep doing great stuff with the Black Cat Lounge. I mean, this is great. I'm so glad to be here and interesting to be able to share this kind of stuff, answer your good questions to all your listeners.
Thank you so much. I'll be right back. Okay. Just give me a couple seconds. Guys, this was one of my favorite all-time interviews. I am so excited about doing this because you guys all know how I am like enmeshed in the Victorian society. You guys all know how I collect Victorian mourning objects, the hair jewelry and all that. You guys all know how I have basically have gone out there and reenacted so much of this culture, both, within the civilian confines and also military confines. So these are all things that were wonderful. And you know what, growing up and actually having read Dracula in my youth, being able to go and reconnect with my youth is a gift in itself. So guys, never leave. You know what? The best way I can close this out is, don't lose that childlike wonderment. When you start losing that, you start losing your creativity and you start looking around at things and it's not as bright. Be creative. Search. And if you look hard enough, like luckily I did, you can find all that stuff that you were just amazed at as a kid. It might be a little changed, but it's always there. This is Tim Shaw at the Black Cat Lounge. Thank you so much for being here with us, and we'll be back next week, Tuesday. Bye-bye. Ciao, babies. This was one of my favorites. That's all I can say.